Do la parola al professor Joseph Tainter dello Utah State University, il cui titolo è Sustainability, the Fundamental Question. Lise.
Buongiorno. I'd like to thank Professor Tartaglia for the invitation to be here today, and also the members of the organizing committee. It's a great pleasure to be back in the beautiful city of Torino. I'm going to talk today about what I consider to be the fundamental question of sustainability. Near the end of World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt asked Vannevar Bush, who was the director of the Wartime Office of Scientific Research and Development, to draft a report on the post-war role of government in promoting science. In his famous report, Bush wrote, and I quote, "Advances in science will bring higher standards of living, will lead to the prevention or cure of diseases, will promote conservation of our limited natural resources, and will assure means of defense against aggression." This statement, so characteristic of our faith in science, became the basis for the emphasis on innovation that we know today. It is a system that has brought material prosperity in the industrialized countries and high levels of employment. Bush's statement reflects what is called technological optimism, a faith in technology to solve problems. Technological optimism is reflected in views of our future, and particularly in the discipline of economics. And I'm going to give you some representative quotations. No society can escape the general limits of its resources, but no innovative society need accept Malthusian diminishing returns. All observers of energy seem to agree that various energy alternatives are virtually inexhaustible. And the third quotation, by allocation of resources to research and development, we may deny the Malthusian hypothesis and prevent the conclusion of the doomsday models. The alternative view, expressed, for example, by Jared Diamond, is that innovation will not offset resource depletion. Diamond states, a modern societal collapse would be, quote, triggered ultimately by scarcity of environmental resources. Which of these views is correct? I present here two charts compiled by my colleague Doyne Farmer. The larger chart shows that the prices of many commodities have, on average, stayed constant, adjusted for inflation, for the past 50 years. The smaller chart shows that the price of coal has also stayed constant, adjusted for inflation. One way of interpreting these charts is that resource depletion has been offset by innovation and improvements in efficiency. This is what the technological optimists and conventional economists would predict. In the perspective of conventional economics, resources are never scarce. They're just priced wrong. Subscribing to what has been called the principle of infinite substitutability, conventional thinkers assume that, provided that markets are undistorted, innovators will respond to price signals and develop solutions to the problems of the day. Sustainability in this perspective is not an issue. This brings us to what I consider the fundamental question of sustainability. Will we always be able to offset resource depletion by innovation and increasing technological efficiency. In addressing this, my objectives today are twofold. Firstly, to explore the origins of our system of innovation, and secondly, to address how long it might continue. Technologies and other innovations do get retired, but in our time they are added faster than the retirement rate. We keep adding things to our cultural systems: technologies, types of information, occupations, social roles, and so forth. So innovation increases complexity, and in fact, innovation is a primary way that complexity grows. To explore something that is so fundamental to modern life, it's important to understand the biases that prevent us from fully understanding innovation. These are, firstly, since we live in a period of institutionalized innovation, we assume unconsciously that high-frequency innovation is normal. Secondly, we assume unconsciously that complexity is desirable and intentional. And thirdly, we have developed ideologies to legitimize our current way of life, exemplified in terms like progress and opportunity. In contrast to these biases, my main points are, firstly, that complexity is rare in human societies and high complexity is recent. Secondly, that human history has not been characterized by high rates of innovation. Thirdly, that today's high complexity and institutionalized innovation are controlled by specific external conditions. Fourthly, that our system of innovation is self-perpetuating under those conditions. And fifthly, that the continuity of today's system depends on the continuity of those conditions. So the first point I would like to address is that complexity is recent, and as such, it is rare. Some of the primary concerns of my own fields of history and anthropology have been to understand how and why some human societies went from this to this. In other words, grew greatly in complexity. Now, there are many meanings of complexity, and my own approach to it stems from the long-standing problem in anthropology and history of understanding how highly differentiated and highly complex human societies came about. Within this view, complexity consists of two elements. The first is diversification and specialization in structure, meaning more parts and more kinds of parts. And the second is integration and control of behavior. The evolution of human societies, or at least of many human societies, has meant increasing differentiation of structure and increasing organization or integration of parts. There are many misconceptions about cultural complexity, the most common being that complexity is an accomplishment, something our ancestors worked to achieve. Highly complex societies, for example, are called civilizations. All societies have ancestor myths, and this is part of ours. The problem with this belief is that complexity costs. In any living system, differentiating structure and increasing organization carries a metabolic cost. The cost is ultimately paid in the currency of energy, but we humans think of the cost in terms of surrogate accounting systems, such as time, money, taxes, and annoyance. In terms of understanding why human societies ever became more complex, it's important to remember that in the past, increasing the complexity of a society meant that people had to work harder. We're largely unaware of this today because to us, complexity appears to be free. We pay for it through fossil fuels. In the past, though, the cost of complexity must always have acted to constrain increases in complexity. If complexity costs, though, we are left with the fundamental question: why in human history, over at least the past 5,000 years, has complexity seemed consistently to increase? The reason is that increasing complexity is a primary way that we solve problems. Confronted with problems, our solutions tend to involve more elaborate technologies, proliferation of specializations in social roles, processing more information, or engaging in new kinds of activities. To give a couple of examples, to deal with the problem of terrorism, we have differentiated structure. That is to say, in the United States at least, we've created new government agencies, such as the Department of Homeland Security and the Transportation Security Administration. And we have increased organization. That is to say, control over the types of behavior from which a threat might arise. And as we know, this has imposed both monetary and other costs on all of us. As another example, to deal with the problems of oil consumption and pollution, manufacturers now sell automobiles with 2 engines, where previously 1 would suffice. The structure has been differentiated. There are 2 different types of engines, and the organization comes through the software that makes the 2 engines work together. So the implications of the discussion to this point are, firstly, that innovations increase complexity. Secondly, when complexity relies on solar energy and human labor, as it did through most of human history, the cost of complexity inhibits innovation. And third, the fact that we have institutionalized innovation today indicates that there has been a fundamental change in the historical context of innovation. Proceeding to my second point, that human history has not been characterized by high rates of innovation. Human ancestors can be traced perhaps about 4 million years. In this early period, the technology stayed largely unchanged for periods of hundreds of thousands of years. Even from the appearance of Homo sapiens, about 200,000 years ago, there have been periods of tens of thousands of years of technological stasis. It is particularly telling that in Africa during this time, new technologies would sometimes emerge, be used for a time, and then dropped. These technologies were not, in other words, progress. They were simply needed for a while and discarded when they were no longer needed. Even in recent history, there have been periods of hundreds to thousands of years with little change in many areas of life. Agriculture in 800 BC and agriculture in 800 AD were not very different. Why is this? Well, the first reason is that 90% of subsistence economies involve the production of energy, mainly agriculture. This meant that there was little wealth to support innovators or for education. Some of the reasons are, firstly, that land transport costs were high, and secondly, that peasants had little money to buy manufactured items. But it's worth noting the exception, that there were often salient innovations in the military sphere. Secondly, people had found technological solutions that worked, whereas innovation increases complexity. And thirdly, under conditions of low population and much land, there was little need to innovate. Ancient states encouraged cultivation and population growth because population and production were never enough to pay the tax revenues that governments needed. This is a chart put together by the English historian Roger Fouquet that shows, among other things, it's a chart showing patents sealed in Great Britain. And what it shows, among other things, is that high-frequency innovation is fairly recent, dating from the end of the 18th century on this chart, a phenomenon of the modern world. Based on this discussion, I think we can reach several conclusions. Firstly, that high-frequency innovation is not an innate characteristic of human societies. It has not characterized us throughout our history. And secondly, that such an unusual characteristic can exist only in specific historical circumstances. Proceeding to my third point on specific conditions of innovation. The conditions that allow our system of innovation to exist today are firstly inexpensive energy, permitting high complexity and discretionary consumption. Secondly, profit seeking. And thirdly, competition forcing continual innovation. As for inexpensive energy, the chart shows that inexpensive energy is recent, dating perhaps from the beginning of the 19th century. In other words, inexpensive energy dates from the era of fossil fuels. As energy has grown less expensive, it has become a smaller and smaller part of the economy. We can see a major drop in the role of energy in the economy in the 16th century, and then another major drop with the development of fossil fuels. The drop in the 16th century is problematic. Roger Fouquet suggests that it came about from lower wages and cheaper agricultural products. I suspect it actually resulted from the infusion into Europe of New World gold and silver. Whatever the cause, this drop in the role of energy in the economy allowed the Renaissance to happen in Northern Europe. Then relative power expenditures remained constant until fossil fuels, as I say, came into play in the 19th century. The system is self-perpetuating today. It is self-perpetuating because, firstly, profit-seeking is unlikely to disappear. Secondly, because competition spurs innovation. And third, because increasing complexity from innovation is affordable with inexpensive energy. This last point leads to what I call the energy complexity spiral. Although inexpensive energy has been rare in human history, when we do have it, it allows complexity to grow, which means that energy allows innovation to grow. At the same time, growing complexity requires more energy, hence the spiral. And as mentioned, problem solving, which is inevitable, also causes complexity to grow, requiring more energy. To give an example of this in practice, last summer there was an article in The Economist magazine on bringing electricity to some rural villages in India. In these villages, new energy stimulates positive feedback, which causes economic activity to grow in scale and also in complexity. In other words, as is common with humans, give us more energy and we quickly find ways to use it. Something like this, on a much larger scale, is what brought about the modern world. Point 5, if our system of innovation today is not the normal human condition, but depends on specific circumstances, we must face the question, how long can it continue? Our system today requires two things. It requires, firstly, continued inexpensive energy. This is energy that is a small part of the economy, allowing for discretionary spending and high complexity in our way of life. And secondly, constant or increasing returns to innovation. And in both areas, I'll try to show that there are reasons for concern. Regarding the first point, inexpensive energy. As we know, it takes energy to get energy. This leads to the concept of what's known as energy returned on energy invested, or EROI. What matters is not how much oil is still in the ground, but the return on getting it out. In the 1940s, about 1940, the United States was able to produce oil and gas at an EROI of about 100 to 1. That's now down to a figure of about 15 to 1, and in the tar sands it runs at about 3 to 2. We can see from these statistics that the easy oil has been found and mostly pumped out. The new discoveries of oil, and there are new discoveries of oil being made off the coast of Brazil, in the Arctic, off the coast of Greenland. The new oil is being found in places that I refer to as deep, dark, cold, remote, and dangerous. As we have to drill in such places, EROI declines and cost increases as we need more complex and expensive technology to get oil. This trend is not reversible. This brings up what is known as the energy cliff. The chart shows in the dark blue area the energy profit of producing energy, with EROI decreasing from left to right. As EROI approaches about 8 or so, the energy profit of producing energy goes off a cliff. When this happens, the cost of energy will return to a dominant role in the economy, leaving less money for sustaining complexity, for investment, for consumption, and for innovation. The second factor, and this is the point that I think is overlooked by technological optimists and conventional economists, is that knowledge production, like other human activities, grows complex and reaches diminishing returns. Innovation tends to grow in complexity and costliness and exhausts easy solutions to problems. The productivity of innovation is therefore not constant. Research problems over time grow increasingly complex and difficult to solve. And in response, our systems of innovation grow increasingly complex and correspondingly more costly. In the 19th century, for example, where research was done by lone naturalists, you think of Darwin or Gregor Mendel, now it is increasingly the province of research teams. A few years ago, I did an image search on Google for the term research team and produced over 61,000 images. These teams are usually large and interdisciplinary. They require expensive facilities, buildings, and administrations. Research, in other words, has grown complex and costly. Recently, I worked with two colleagues, Deborah Strumsky and Jose Lobo, who had access to databases of US patents that allow us to test whether our investments in research and development have reached diminishing returns. My colleagues have constructed a database of over 5 million patents. Of these, more than 50% come from non-US entities, so the data reflect the productivity of innovation worldwide. Our first result shows that the size of teams needed to achieve an innovation has been increasing. The size of teams needed to achieve an innovation has been increasing. It is taking more and more innovators to produce a single invention. The growth in size of patenting teams along that line reflects the increase in complexity and difficulty of the research enterprise. Yet while the size of patenting team grows, the outputs, measured as patents per inventor, has been declining. Over a period of about 30 years on this chart, about the length of an average scientist's career, the productivity of innovation has declined by more than 20%. It is common for older technical fields to become less productive in innovation. This has been known for many decades. We have assumed, though, that this is offset by higher productivity of innovation in newer technical sectors. To investigate whether this is so, we have studied a selection of both older and newer technical sectors. This chart shows the productivity of innovation in surgery and medical instruments, metalworking, and optics. These are older technical sectors in which there are still active programs of research. The chart shows that the productivity of this research is declining. Similarly, in the sectors of drugs and chemicals, in which there are active research programs, we see a similar trend of declining productivity of innovation. The next chart may be the most disturbing one of all. It shows the productivity of innovation in the energy sector. Energy is the most important factor in our future, yet in each sector we are experiencing diminishing productivity to innovation. This is the case even in solar and wind technologies, the bottom two here, on which we may need someday to rely. Based on this chart, it looks like it's possible that the solar and wind energy sectors are already technically mature. Now let's look at some of the newer areas of innovation and see whether we see rising productivity in those sectors as conventional economists would predict. This is the newer area of information technology, which has driven our economies for the past 30 years or more. Even though we are continually presented with new electronic products, we can see that the productivity of innovation in these sectors has been declining. The newest technical sectors are biotechnology and nanotechnology. They were recognized by the US Patent Office only in 1980. In these sectors, we would expect to see increasing productivity of innovation. Yet we see just the opposite. From their inception, these fields show diminishing productivity in research. To test whether complexity is a factor in this phenomenon, we looked at the number of technology codes per patent over time. That's this line here, this dashed line here. Patent applications must cite the technologies on which an innovation builds. These technologies are classified by the Patent Office as technology codes. The results show an increasing number of technology codes per patent, suggesting increasing complexity through about 1995, then some undulation through about 2000, and then some decline at the end of the series. The decline at the end of the series is probably just an artifact of the fact that more complex applications take longer to process. At the same time, as I've noted, technology codes per patenting author decline throughout the period, suggesting that patent authors are specializing ever more narrowly. Based on these charts, based on this analysis that I did with my two colleagues, I believe there is grave concern about the productivity of innovation, of our system of innovation, continuing into the future. Now, in business, the productivity of innovation is considered proprietary information, but the information may be available in the public sector. And just to give a verbal illustration of this quotation comes from former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who noted, since 9/11, that would be September 11, 2001, a near doubling of the Pentagon's modernization accounts, more than $700 billion over 10 years in new spending on procurement, research, and development, has resulted in relatively modest gains in actual military capability. More and more money is consumed by fewer and fewer platforms that take longer and longer to build. Now, we may or may not sympathize with the problems in the military sector. I use this quotation because it illustrates the overall problem of the declining productivity of innovation. And you can see in this chart at the bottom some of the consequences of having to build more complex and costly technologies with diminishing returns. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States produced 740 B-52 strategic bombers. When the B-1 bomber was introduced in the 1980s, the United States produced 100 of them. When the B-2 bomber was introduced, we produced only 12 of them. The trend we see in innovation is summed up in two statements by scholars who have looked at the problem. The first is by the philosopher Nicholas Rusher, who's written extensively on this topic. And he writes quite eloquently, in natural science, we are involved in a technological arms race. With every victory over nature, the difficulty of achieving the breakthroughs which lie ahead is increased. The second quotation is from an extraordinary book published 50 years ago called Little Science, Big Science. It is a book that is still worth reading if you are interested in trends in scientific productivity, written by Derek DeSola Price. And he wrote, it is clear that science cannot go up, that is, increase another 2 orders of magnitude as it has climbed to the last 5. Scientific doomsday is therefore less than a century away. What he means by scientific doomsday is the day when science can no longer continue to grow. He predicted that it was less than a century away, and since he wrote that, half that time has elapsed. He wrote it half a century ago. What are the implications? Firstly, barring unforeseen developments, our system of innovation is heading in the direction of becoming either unproductive or unaffordable or both. Secondly, we have plucked much of the low-lying fruit in the area of knowledge production. Fundamental discoveries like electricity and penicillin no longer wait to be made. Thirdly, as research problems grow increasingly intractable, the complexity of the research enterprise increases, leading to diminishing returns to research investments. And fourthly, we have the impression of continued progress because the scale of the research enterprise has grown so large, and it has been proposed to grow larger still, although, as Derek DeSole at Price pointed out, there are limits to how large it can grow. So it appears then that the historical conditions that make our system of innovation possible will not continue. Firstly, declining EROI and increasing resource costs will reduce discretionary spending. Secondly, increasing complexity and costs will limit energy production, curtailing growth. Thirdly, increasing complexity and costs of innovation and diminishing returns will curtail investments in innovation. And fourthly, by the end of this century, our system of innovation will look very different if it endures in anything like its present form. These are the basic points that the technological optimists and conventional economists have not considered, and they are the reason why I think ultimately they will be proven to be wrong. Innovation will not forever offset resource depletion. And so, to conclude, we return to the fundamental question of sustainability. Are the technological optimists correct? Can we always innovate to overcome resource depletion and other problems? Or is our system of innovation vulnerable to its own decline, mirroring the decline of the factors that made it possible? And finally, can we sustain our way of life if, as seems inevitable, our system of innovation declines? Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Tainter. Adesso